to know what conundrum means. Anyway, I was trying to meet the challenge, and so I'm not talking about Edinburgh, and maybe I'm not even talking about what is usually talked about when you talk about authenticity. I'm rather talking about what happens to interest me at this particular moment in time. Because I always try to take every opportunity to explore my thinking. Now, in this particular case, I would like to start with this philosophical conundrum. And I was thinking, what are the elements that actually are part of this? And I think the first point I would like to say is that if this question of conservation is at all universal, it should somehow be part also of philosophy. So I think if we are looking at, we should not think that conservation is something separate, authenticity is a sort of a hiccup of some conservationists. I think it should be part of the human culture. And human culture is sort of like, as I would say, carries testimony, for example, to the human creativity. And I think this whole question of human creativity is taken as one of the principal issues for World Heritage Outstanding Universal Value. I would like to just say couple of words about this authenticity. And I'm referring to Cesare Brandi, who is, shall we say, a well-known theorist from Italy, who has written the theory of restoration, which you may not know, or you may know. Some of you certainly will know. What is interesting, perhaps, in this particular context, that Brandi takes a very particular position in relation to the creativity and the production of something which can be defined as work of art. He thinks that it does not depend on the social cultural context, but it is a sort of like an independent process. So he thinks that this human creativity is universal and not dependent, it exists in all cultures. That is what he wants to say. Doesn't matter what culture we are talking about, human creativity exists. On the other hand, it does not mean that the work of art or the cultural expressions which are the result of this creativity would not reflect the social and cultural conditions. So we have to understand there are two things which are one thing. On the one hand, there exists the concept of creativity. On the other hand, the results reflect these cultural, social, cultural issues. And he is thinking about this a little bit in the same way as Martin Heidegger, and this is an introductory interpretation of Heidegger's creativity. They think that if we have a natural object which has no human work in it, that is like one case. But then you can also have a human object which is the result of creativity, but where the scope of the creation is outside the object. Therefore it becomes like an instrument or tool for doing something. In some way, even architecture is in a way an instrument for living and working. On the other hand, if the work of art has the scope in the work of art is in the work itself, so that the only idea is to create that work. It's not an instrument for anything else. So it's not like a chair that you are sitting, we are making it a nice chair, but your purpose is that you can sit on it. Then he considers it a work of art, Heidegger. But it's interesting that, of course, like architecture, for example, architecture is the result of creativity, but it's also somehow a tool, an instrument. So these two issues can actually live together parallelly, but depends on where you put your emphasis. If you put the emphasis on the work of art aspect of architecture, then your conservation aspect as activities will focus on that particular aspect. But if you put the focus on the building as an instrument for living and so on, then your emphasis is on, say, rehabilitation and on all sorts of things. So that the conservation activity, for example, will change according to this case. Now, I have tried to translate this creative process of Cesare Grandi in this way. He was saying that normally, if we are thinking of a painter, for example, the painter would look at the model, in this case, a famous painter, who was doing his own self-portrait, Van Gogh, and so he starts with an existential reality. Then the painter would create an image in his own mind and then translate that into a painting, physical form. So this is the immaterial part of this work of art, which then is added to the material and gives significance to the material, gives meaning to the material. So this creative process means that we are actually putting together the tangible and intangible aspects of the work of art. So we can say that at the end of the day, when we have a work of art, it must necessarily be understood in both aspects, both tangible and intangible. We cannot separate them. And this is not only true to, shall we say, modern works of art, but it is also true to traditional cultural expressions. Because even then, you will have material and the cultural meaning which is given by the tradition or the culture itself. It's interesting also that Brandi is calling a work of art, defining it in Italian, fenomeno che non è fenomeno. Phenomenon which is not phenomenon. Phenomenon in the sense that it is a physical artifact, but it's not a phenomenon in the sense that it's also has also the intangible aspect. And I think it is very important to understand that we have these two things together. Now, if we go to the UNESCO recommendations or conventions, UNESCO has different types of conventions, and there is also a convention from 2003 for the conservation of intangible cultural heritage. And then somehow the people have now interpreted that the 1972 World Heritage Convention is for the protection of tangible cultural heritage. But I would say that in both cases we need to take both aspects together. Maybe in one case the emphasis is different from the other. I've been also thinking about this philosophy in terms of what are the important characteristics of authenticity in relation to cultural heritage objects. And I would say that there are two aspects. One is time and the other one is truth. In fact, authenticity comes from the word autos, which means oneself, which means true. Truthfulness. So truthfulness is the main issue. And of course, time and truth have been part of the philosophical discussion from always. Difficult to remember when it was not. But the time can have different interpretations. For example, in India, or maybe some other countries as well, there has been a certain interpretation that time is cyclical, while in the, shall we say, in the European context, it's more like linear. And we have different definitions for the concept of time in modern philosophy. You have Henri Bergson, you have Martin Heidegger, and you have also Albert Einstein. What I find interesting in Albert Einstein is that he concluded in his later years that the past, the present, and the future all exist simultaneously in a place. And I think this is very interesting for cultural heritage. So the cultural heritage in some way incorporates its time from its beginning. We can call it historic timeline if you like, but also historical stratigraphy if you like. But it means that you have the past and the present together in the same time. So whether time is then cyclical or linear, it doesn't matter. They are all here, so it's like at the same time. And he's also including the future into the same issue. Of course, the question of truth has been discussed always in philosophy as well. You have the ancient Greek philosopher like Parmenides, who was thinking that truth is a goddess. And he said also that the truth is open to the divinities, but for the humans, you can only get a glimpse of the truth if you make an effort, and then it usually easily becomes hidden again. So if the human beings don't make an effort, they will not be able to understand the truth, which makes it that we will have to continuously work for understanding the truth. It's not obvious and it's not automatic. I also think that, well, it's obvious. If you look at the World Heritage List, you will notice that the major part of the World Heritage List, especially cultural heritage, has religious attributes, spiritual attributes, because the people somehow have always associated spirituality and religion somehow together with cultural heritage and so on. It is where we have put more emphasis, more effort. The churches, the mosques, the shrines, temples, and so on, they are our issues. But also we can find the question of truth, again, always in religion, in different ways. For example, in Taoism, it is the way to the truth. In Buddhism, it is in the suffering. In Hinduism, there is a natural order which has the truth. Sikhism has its own issues. Islam and Christianity have it in the Holy Word, which is in the Holy Book. Truth is also understood in some cases in the society and in relation to environment. For example, in Africa, truth in a way is not so much based on scientific facts, but it's more like a result of social agreement. And in Africa, people tend to see themselves as part of the environment. I think it is very interesting to learn from the Africans, because we can learn somehow aspects which are not necessarily remembered in the sort of Western philosophy. And I think that we should have much more contact. We should sort of like try to understand what is being thought there. And I think we can try to improve our own thinking as a result. Search for truth has been then in philosophy, especially in modern philosophy from the 17th and 18th centuries. We have, for example, Descartes, who was saying that I think, therefore I exist, or Giambattista Vico, who was identifying truth in mathematics. He was saying that you can calculate the truth, you can verify if that is true, or you can experience by observation, for example, from nature. but you can also make it yourself. It becomes like a creative act. When you do it yourself, it becomes like a factum, a fact. Then they have this, you know it exactly. Now, God has created the world, therefore only God can understand the nature, but human beings have created their own culture. Therefore, human culture should be interpreted by the human beings. But the different generations and the different cultures may have their own specific value judgments. Therefore, we have to understand what particular culture has produced a particular artifact. So the truth can only be understood within the context in relation to time and place. Johann von Herder then took these ideas into more like the concept of national monument and the fact that the nation was responsible for conservation of the issues which represented the, shall we say, the achievement of a nation. Truth can of course also be understood as a scientific fact, which is very much the result of Western thinking, although it can also be said it's not always, never a final truth, because the scientist can continue exploring things and maybe find new facts, new issues which are related to that. Another aspect which is there is memory. And again, the philosophers are thinking about, you have Arne Bergson, for example, who wrote a big book about memory. And memory is very important for conservation of cultural heritage. Just think about John Ruskin and his book of memory in the Seven Lamps. So these are some of the issues which are somehow, like, I would say, related more to the philosophical aspect. As Ruxandra asked me to talk a little bit about that aspect as well. But then I would like to go a little bit to the cultural heritage itself. And we can say that we have a certain development that's taken place in the past 50 years, which means that immediately after the Second World War, we had, of course, a very dramatic situation in the world, and therefore we were trying to safeguard what was possible, and we also went into the adventure and challenge of reconstruction in some cases. The Venice Charter is one of the fundamental documents of that particular period, but we should remember also that the Venice Charter is not a law. It's the result of some reflection in a specific historic moment. So it should be historicized. It's a historic document. It's a historical monument in a way. And I think as such, it has great significance because from that time onwards, there has been a series of other products of thinking which have accumulated something that we can call now today international doctrine. But we should not say that the Venice Charter resolves all the problems. It is the starting point for the thinking process, which can then give us some guidelines. So I'm not defending any of these specifically. I think we have to take them in the context. But it's also interesting that as a result of all these documents, we have also expanded our understanding what should be recognized as cultural heritage. Today, we are not only talking about, even if we are mainly interested in cultural heritage, it is now being recognized over these past 10, 15 years that culture and nature go together. The cultural heritage people have recognized that actually nature exists and needs to be taken into account. And cultural landscape, for example, is one of the results of that sort of thing. But also the natural heritage people who were often thinking that the natural World Heritage sites should not be contaminated by human beings. Now they recognize that actually many natural heritage sites are whatever they are because of human beings. The human beings have contributed, like Aboriginals in Australia. They have created the nature. And now IUCN is responsible for evaluation of natural World Heritage properties. IUCN and Entourage, they are now, I have a big book which is Sacred Natural Heritage Sites. Now sacredness has entered also in the nature. I mean, it is true that I think it's a good idea, but it means that we are actually approaching, and we have had an interesting circle. We started together, nature and culture. We were separated, maybe partly due to the French Revolution or maybe various other things. We are coming back together. So there has been like a full circle. And of course, we can say that cultural heritage is based on recognition. I think it is interesting that culture, of course, itself is the factor who is driving us in a certain way. It is the culture which is producing heritage, and it is the culture which is helping us to recognize that's the same heritage. We can say that cultural heritage consists, as I was saying before, of the material basis, but also the immaterial cultural significance. And we have these different aspects which I listed here: creativity, truth, time, and memory, which I think together somehow contribute to the understanding of what is authenticity. Cultural heritage is interesting also. This is from the UNESCO 2005 Convention, which is dealing with the protection of the diversity of cultural expressions. And they are defining the cultural expressions as those expressions that result from the creativity of individuals and that have cultural content. So it means that actually we can, the work of art concept that I started with, in a way, is a very particular product. The cultural expression is a much more general way of calling the result of human creativity. So therefore we can say that all cultural products are expressions of culture. And they are particularly then characterized by diversity. So we recognize that each place, each cultural heritage has its own specificity, its own truth, its own authenticity. And that is what we should try to maintain and guarantee continuity of its maintenance due to various management and other problems. Conservation. Conservation is aiming at that. Cultural and heritage diversity, in fact, have been already very much part of the Nara document on authenticity, which resulted from an expert meeting in Nara in Japan in 1994. I happened to be representing ICROM at that time, so I was one of the team who was writing this document or producing the document. And here, it's interesting that while this document was specifically talking about authenticity, and at the end of the day, it talks much more about cultural and heritage diversity. In many ways, this Nara document became like a new paradigm. It sort of like opened way to a new way of looking at cultural heritage, understanding it through the qualities and values which are embedded in the different cultures. So we were trying to avoid measuring everything on the basis of Western culture, for example. the Eurocentrism was like pushed aside. And we recognize that Indians, Africans, Latin Americans, they have their own cultural aspects, their own specificity. We have to make an effort to understand what is the authenticity of those particular cultural expressions. Not in comparison to some prefixed model, but we have to understand what is the particular question which is relevant and important to that particular culture. Just as a matter of an anecdote, I would say that Japan ratified the World Heritage Convention in 1992, I think, 1992. I was then working at ICRAM, and so there was a Japanese professor, a certain Professor Nobuo Ito, who asked me if I would like to come to Japan and to look at some important sites, such as the Ise Shrine, which is a Shinto shrine which is regularly rebuilt every 20 years as part of a ritual. Because at the same time, the World Heritage Convention was 20 years becoming a sort of like maturity. And there was a booklet which was written by a certain Professor Bresuir, who had been doing the ICOMOS evaluations. And in this booklet, Bresuir was mentioning that now as Japan has ratified the World Heritage Convention, they also have to adjust their restoration processes in harmony with the international doctrine. And the Japanese were a bit offended by this. So that is the reason why they first asked if I could come, but then also we discussed that in 1993 in the ICOMOS General Assembly in Colombo, and it was decided we could organize an international expert conference in Japan, which happened in 1994. And before that, we had a preliminary meeting in Norway at the beginning of the same year, which actually already identified what are the parameters for the definition of authenticity. And of course, in some way, we came back to these sort of like framework, but we were especially interested in moving away from the definition only in relation to physical aspects of the cultural heritage. We introduced various types of intangible aspects into this whole question. And in fact, that is where this question of intangible cultural heritage then also started coming up. And as a result, the UNESCO then went on and had this Intangible Cultural Heritage Convention in 2003, and then 2005 we had the cultural expression, diversity of cultural expressions. The question, of course, is that we have to understand what is the meaning of a place. I've just been thinking about it this way. We have to understand what does a place mean, because it is when we know the meaning, then we can associate some value to that place. But if we don't know the meaning, we don't know what it means. Now, we have, for example, here a pile of stones in Finland. A pile of stones, this is actually in Scotland, I think. This is another pile of stone in Norway, and a pile of stone in Norway. This is a World Heritage Site. It is actually a prehistoric burial, Neolithic burial site in western Finland. This is a boundary stone indicating a property. This is a road mark in Norway to show how road work goes across the mountains. And this is just a pile of stones left by the visitors and tourists. So in every case we have stone as material, but in every case the stone has a completely different meaning. And in one case it is even a World Heritage Site, but they are still stones. So I think that it is very interesting that if we want to understand also the question of authenticity, we have to understand what is the meaning of the place. So I think we can go through a sort of like a process identifying what is it, what are the signs of a particular theme, what is the signification, and how we can then, what sort of value we can then associate with a place. And the value is always a result of comparison. Therefore, I will say that there is a lot of talk about value-based management. And of course, in a certain moment in time, when we have built up the values, we can talk about value-based management. But first of all, we have to understand what is the meaning of the place. And that is already the starting of the management process. So the management process can produce the value judgments. It can produce, it's a learning process which helps to understand the meaning and therefore the result. Now, as part of the e-commerce activity, we also developed a thematic framework for the significance, and there are these 6 categories. And of course, this has been published by e-commerce in 2005, I think. You can find it also on the internet if you like. It is we called it the gap report, because the idea was to analyze what is World Heritage List, what is already contained in the World Heritage List, and what is lacking, what are the gaps. And in fact, there is a sort of like a typological analysis, then there is a historical, chronological, geographical analysis, identifying what are the cultural regions which are represented, what are the periods of time which are represented, and finally there is a thematic framework analysis, and this is the main headings of the thematic framework. And so when you are talking about identifying identify the significance of a place, we have to start with the idea of what are the themes which have universal meaning. And for example, in this case, Røros mining town in Norway, it was initially put on the World Heritage List just as a small wooden town in the mountain region. But more recently, it was recognized actually in 2010, because there was an extension which was proposed, which took into account also the mining region which was the reason why the town existed. Because at the beginning it was only recognized as architecture, only wooden architecture. But then it became a mining town, and therefore it suddenly had a new meaning. And so there is a much more extensive issue. What is interesting here, we are not talking about great works of art, we are talking about very simple architecture or the various archaeological remains, which together form the significance, justify the outstanding significance of the place. Heritage recognition in some way can go through that sort of process. Just as a matter of curiosity, this is from China. It's a place called Guangzhou, which was a small island near Taiwan, near the continent. It was like a place where foreigners had their embassies, and they had representations. And this was a place through which China was in contact with Western countries, for example. It became like a cultural link between China and the Western world. Now they are proposing to propose it to the World Heritage List eventually. But anyway, the question is that we have to start from the meaning and significance, then we can identify what are the elements which together justify that meaning, which belong to that meaning. And then we can identify the social or functional integrity of the place. and the authenticity of cultural expressions, which is the creativity which has produced them, the specificity. And then we can look at the historical aspects and finally have the visual integrity. So I think this is in a way a logical sequence which usually has to be gone through in order to understand, because we cannot start talking about authenticity if we have not identified what authenticity are what and in relation to what. Condition of integrity, so therefore, is the main thing to start with. And we have this particular picture is from Asmara in Eritrea, which this town developed. It had some ancient origins, but it developed especially in the first part of the 20th century, and very particularly in the 1930s as an Italian colonial capital city in this particular region. And as a result, it has quite interesting colonial architecture. It is a very well preserved historic urban landscape, which has some quite fantastic places like this service station with a Fiat on the top. It is very, very interesting. What is interesting also anyway is that in here, they were not only doing modern movement buildings, they were doing buildings in the same time, reflecting different styles, including also impact from the African context. So it is a very interesting thing. Another example about talking always about the integrity and authenticity together is Palmanova in Italy. It is a fortified ideal city created at the end of the 16th century and built in the 17th, 18th centuries. Initially, the fortifications were first built, but only part of the town actually was constructed immediately. It was like result of a longer process, and some of the buildings are relatively recent. What is interesting here is that it has anyway maintained its overall integrity. Now the question is that they are also proposing this to the World Heritage List as part of a serial nomination. And so then the question is that you have, of course, these fortifications. You have part of the original 17th, 18th century built fabric, but you also have a certain number of modern buildings. So then the question is to have some good guidelines which will say what are the limits of new buildings, what sort of new buildings you could build into that context without undermining the qualities or the values of this place. Of course, another example, for example, is the historic city of Graz, which was put on the World Heritage List in 1999. And as an exemplary model of the living heritage of Central European urban complex, especially in the sort of 17th and 18th centuries, from the Middle Ages to the 18th century. That was the idea. That is what are the specific qualities. But now there is a Kulturhaus by a British gentleman which is called the Friendly Alien, which has absolutely zero contact with this World Heritage justification, because it's not 18th century, it's very modern. The people like it, but of course it's really an alien. I don't know how friendly. Anyway, the question is that today one of the problems about this authenticity and creativity is that people are carried away with this authenticity and trying to say, I want to have an authentic product, which means I want to do something that I only can do, and I want to leave my memorandum in my memorial in this town. And when you are carried away without taking into account the context, it is not always successful. In this case, the World Heritage Committee somehow closed one eye, and they didn't delete this site from the World Heritage List. But I think that it should be at least taken seriously. And now, for example, I understand that Liverpool is facing the same problem, but maybe a bit more serious than here. Anyway, so when we come then to the verification of authenticity, we have to first of all identify what are the sources of information. Because in fact it is said that the knowledge and understanding of the sources of information in relation to original and subsequent characteristics of the cultural heritage and their meaning, that is the requisite basis for assessing all aspects of authenticity. So we can say in this preliminary meeting to the NARA conference, we already decided a proposed list of possible sources of information. I would also like to say that this is not a full list. It's not pretended to be the only and final list, because these sources of information may vary from case to case, and it may not, I mean, maybe there are other types of heritage which were not yet considered, but what is important here is that we have, for example, form and design, materials and substance, use and function, traditions and techniques, location and setting, spirit and feeling, language, other types of intangible and so on aspects. So these are the sources of information which can help us to identify issues. So we have to identify, there is a process. You start from identifying the source of information through social functional integrity, and if they are true and credible, we can say that it satisfies the requirement of authenticity, the test of authenticity. In practice, I would like to take a couple of examples. This is Bagrati Cathedral here. It was built, it's in Georgia, and this is next to the town which is called Kutaisi. This cathedral was actually built about 1000. I think it was completed in 1003, and it worked until the 17th century, but then it was destroyed by the Ottoman army, and it remained in ruins. Until then, they decided, the local archaeologists discovered enough evidence of its original form that they started reconstructing it. So this is the Bagrati Cathedral in the 1930s in an old photograph. Then it was built, so this picture is from a couple of years ago, but actually this is the way it was standing in 1994. In 1994 it was accepted to the World Heritage List. This is the interior of the site. But then, from 1994, Georgia, which had become independent from Soviet Union, then had no money to start continuing the construction. So it was only in about 2001 or 2002 that the authorities found enough financial resources to continue the work of the construction. But then in 2002 there was an ICOMOS mission by some gentleman who said, "I'm sorry, but you cannot do this sort of reconstruction." And the Georgians were a bit upset about it, but then they decided to continue anyway. And then in 2005 or 2006 there was another mission, and they said, "Okay, if you don't stop this reconstruction, then you will have trouble." And then the Georgians decided to stop the reconstruction. They considered anyway that the reconstruction was necessary because of the structural stability of the building. Because particularly the fact is that these columns originally were built as sort of like an archaeological reconstruction, not not well reinforced. So they were very fragile and subject to earthquake problems, and this is seismic region. So they needed reinforcement. And as this was a ruined building, they had to put reinforced concrete. So they started building foundations. And they also did archaeological excavations under the church. And they found that while this church was built in the 10th century, there had already been 3 other churches on the same site. The first one from the, I think from the 5th century, 4th or 5th century, and then another from the 7th and 8th, and then from the 10th. And so it was a sacred site. And they decided to preserve these layers of archaeological evidence under the church, and the pillars or foundations were done so that they did not damage those archaeological remains. Also, part of the walls they had no foundation at all. And so they decided that it was necessary to have them. And the second point is that as this building had been without a roof for a while, the wall is a rubble core wall with stones on both sides, and so trees started growing from the interior, and it was really in a very fragile condition. So that was one of the reasons why they wanted to have consolidation. And they, of course, they reinforced concrete here, foundations, and so on. It's interesting that at that time, the ICOMOS, when it was put on the World Heritage list, ICOMOS considered that the criteria which had guided the reconstruction were perfectly in harmony with the international recommendations. This is part of the 1990s reconstruction, which shows that they have preserved all the original elements which they had found on the site, and the new parts are as it is prescribed in the Venice Charter, so that you have a sort of like, it's like an archaeological artifact which has been reconstructed. But then in the 2002, when they continued the reconstruction, they had not enough information for the interior, and so they decided to build sort of like a hypothetical, analogical à la Viollet-le-Duc reconstruction of the interior. And so that was not acceptable to the international experts, and the Georgian authorities decided to demolish this part here. So that was demolished. But they decided that those central columns, which were fundamentally important structurally, had to be maintained. And they were at these reinforced concrete core and foundations. There was a lot of discussion also in Georgia itself. And there were lots of people who were against reconstruction and thinking that it's a shame and that you should not do that. But then the President of the Republic, who was running for the next, his party was running for the next election, actually last year, he gave the order in agreement with the Patriarch, the church, to continue the discussion, to the reconstruction. We had a meeting at UNESCO in 2011 in November, and in that conference ICOMOS accepted that the reconstruction was in principle possible, but they wanted to check the project. Now, as the authorities had demolished this, they invited an Italian architect called Andrea Bruno to design a modern interior for the section where they did not have enough evidence. So they wanted to continue the reconstruction of the walls, but also the cupola, for which they had enough evidence, archaeological evidence. They had found the pieces. They had some 200 pieces from the cupola which had been found on the site. And this picture is then from 2012 in March. And that time there was an international mission with a Greek architect and a UNESCO representative. I was also there, invited by the Georgian authorities. But in this occasion, the Greek architect had been thinking that he was invited to advise the Georgian authorities about the reconstruction and the limits of reconstruction. But when he arrived to the site and he saw that the Georgian had already decided to go ahead with the reconstruction, he was very upset. And in his report, he said that this particular building has lost its authenticity and therefore should be deleted from the World Heritage List. Now, and in fact, the Georgians were trying to discuss with the World Heritage Committee last summer what would be was there any possibility of negotiation? And the World Heritage Committee members decided no. And the reason was that they wanted to make an example that if you don't follow their instructions, then there is some trouble. And this was a perfect example because the Georgian had been continuing the reconstruction without showing the projects and so on. Exactly. So it was taken as a political, guinea pig or sort of like something that they had. Anyway, this is a project of Andrea Bruno. He decided to do this in metal, steel and glass, but harmonizing with the forms of the original cathedral. This is in the corner we found that there was an old staircase, there had been a staircase, and from there it was possible to go up and you could have like a second story floor above the entrance, which could be used for museum purposes and presentation of the history of the place, and it could also become like a balcony for the church or for church activities. So in September 2012, the church had been inaugurated. It was already finished, the reconstruction. But in July in 2012, the World Heritage Committee decided to postpone the decision about the deletion of this for this year now. So next summer they will be deciding about it. But actually, at the same time, they instructed the Georgian authorities to make a major boundary modification for the existing World Heritage site. Because actually there were two sites. In this serial nomination we had Bagrati on the one hand and Gelati some 12 kilometers away. So the idea is now that the Gelati monastery, which had no problem, would remain World Heritage, but the Bagrati would be removed. And therefore the boundary of this World Heritage site would be radically changed so that you would keep only one of this site. And this, which had lost its authenticity, had been taken away. Now this is a picture. It's interesting, the photographer who has made this, an Italian photographer, he was saying that it's very interesting to compare this with the Dutch paintings of the 17th century, because there's a lot of similarity in the sort of spirit of the space. So he had made this reference. But this is the completed modern part of the interior. And what is interesting also that now very recently, just a couple of weeks ago, this work of Andrea Bruno had been given an award for actually a gold medal for a very successful modern design in a historic building. This is a picture showing interior from below. Here we have some pictures in a way the history of the place, and this is a picture of the cathedral as it looks now today. And here is the announcement of the gold medal. There will be a conference on the 23rd of March in Ferrara to present this project. This is Now, in my view, if you want, I think that this church has not lost its authenticity. It was already, people have said that, okay, but it was a ruined church, you cannot do that. But it was already reconstructed so that the walls, if we go back, we can say that the walls had already been mostly built by 1994 when it was put on the World Heritage List. So it was not a ruin, it was a reconstruction in process. And I think that also the fact is that the completed church has continued exactly the same criteria which were already accepted as perfectly acceptable criteria reconstruction in 1994. So I don't see why it could not be accepted as having preserved its authenticity. Of course, there is a lot of new work, that is true. But I think that, as I said, the problem is political. It has been proposed to be removed to give an example to other people. Another case, just as a matter of curiosity, this is the Kolding Castle in Denmark, which was a certain architect called Exner, he was Johannes Exner, who had, this castle had been suffering a fire, and Exner had designed a modern reconstruction, keeping everything that was original, but then all the new parts are completely brand new, wooden construction, and it's quite an interesting example. This other case instead is from Berlin, where they have a new museum, and here the idea has been to try to use the Venice Charter as a guideline, and said you sort of like keep everything original exactly as it is, with all the sort of like the damages of the bombardment, and then you sort of integrate that with modern design in this way. So you can of course have different issues. The reconstruction basically is one of the big problems in many World Heritage sites. This is Vilnius in Lithuania. Vilnius, the historic center of Vilnius, is World Heritage site. This is in the center of the World Heritage site of Vilnius. And here we have a castle, 16th century castle, which was ruined in the 17th century. And it was completely annihilated so that you have practically nothing left except a drawing like that, or maybe a couple of drawings. And on the basis of these drawings, the authorities decided to reconstruct it. This is a picture taken of the World Heritage Committee visiting, members of the World Heritage Committee visiting this reconstruction site. And nobody has said absolutely anything at all against the reconstruction. So reconstruction was completely acceptable here, but not in Baghdad. There are many other cases where you have reconstructed buildings. This is in Van, which had a serious earthquake in 2003 in December. Also, my wife and me, we were visiting Van as part of a study tour after a conference in Jazz. And so this is my picture from 2003 December. And 27th of December, the same month, there was a major earthquake and it fell down. This is in June 2004. At this point, the Iranian authorities decided to put it on the World Heritage list. I was responsible for evaluating it. And of course I'm very favorable to Iranians anyway, due to various accidental reasons. But in this particular case, it was interesting because when we looked at these issues, we could notice that this part had been kept in order through continuous reconstruction by the military authorities who had occupied this site until the 1970s. In 1970s, it was recognized as cultural heritage, and it was taken over by the Cultural Heritage Organization of Iran. It was not actually yet Cultural Heritage Organization, but anyway, the authority is responsible for ancient monuments. And at that point, there was an Italian-trained conservation architect who was responsible for the restoration of this. And so he did a lot of research and studies, and then he retired in 2003 in December, after 25 years of activity of restoration on this site. And that is what happened when he retired. His successor remained under some house who had, for some reason, had been sleeping off in there because it happened during the night, and he had to be hospital for a while. But anyway, he's okay now. Anyway, the Iranians started an active process of restoration. We were also involved in the management plan for the site, and in fact it's so interesting in a way that at the time, in 2004, when it was proposed to the World Heritage List, the Iranian authorities actually only proposed the citadel with a couple of monuments around it. I was then on mission in Iran, and so I took the opportunity to also visit the BAM site, and in collaboration with the Iranian authorities, we decided to expand this proposed nomination to become a cultural landscape. Because as a cultural landscape, it was not anymore the question about this ruined castle or citadel, but it was a historical stratigraphy of the whole cultural landscape. And if you look at those blue lines, they are underground canals or qanats, which were used for irrigation and water management. And we had archaeological evidence for the development of the qanat systems from the Achaemenid period, which is more or less the 4th or 5th century BC, until today. It's a continuous development. And then this is there was a, how to say, seismic fault which was running right through here, and there's a 10-meter difference in Earth. Earth drops 10 meters when you go towards the east, and so that is the reason why it was possible for the people 2,000 years ago to dig actually fairly short canals to get the water to the cultivation. Then later they had to make it longer, so they abandoned the old canals and made new ones because the water table was lowering. It became more deserted. And therefore, we have more than 2,000 years of canal building here. And at the same time, we have a lot of historical monuments which are in this area. So it becomes really a cultural landscape which has particular importance. So we are not just looking at this area, but here too, what was happening as a result of the earthquake is that it was discovered that we have here a historical stratigraphy which goes back to the Neolithic period, and at least in the Achaemenid period they already had a good solid consolidated settlement here, and in many cases this has been subject to continuous reconstruction over centuries. And they've discovered, for example, the Timurid period under the more recent stratification. So at the end, the significance of this site became much more important as a result of the earthquake than what was thought before the earthquake. So actually the earthquake, in this particular case, displayed more information which was available. And then, for example, we just noticed that the site was built as a perfect square, but then there was an extension which corresponds to the diagonal of the perfect square. So it is a very interesting, more or less Hellenistic type of design component, which was very visible still in we have archaeological evidence of that, and they have now discovered quite a lot of, there has been archaeological excavation by different teams, even from Italy or France or Germany and so on, as well as various universities, and we have been able to show the historical stratigraphy and understand the importance of the site, which is not anymore only in the nice reconstructions, but it is more in the historical stratigraphy. And in fact, we have done these various proposals for the management and order of repair and make it safe and so on. And at the same time, the entire cultural landscape, which actually is not just this area which is World Heritage and the surrounding buffer zone, a big valley which has all the water catchment area of this place, which goes 200 kilometers by 30 kilometers. And so the management plan was actually done for the entire valley of BAM area, not just the World Heritage Site, but it was necessary to understand that we are talking about also these various 5 other districts, and which has a lot of these various sites. And so actually it's a very rich cultural landscape as a whole. And also this richness of the cultural landscape as a whole was discovered as a result of the earthquake. So in fact sometimes you can find good results. This is in Oman, where they have a ruined castle which has been now subject to reconstruction. But here it is simply a monument which is being rebuilt. And I'm not quite sure if this reconstruction is really justified, but anyway, it is also World Heritage. The Historic Center of Vienna was put on the World Heritage list in 2001. At the same time, it was recognized that there were new skyscrapers being built somewhere in the buffer zone, and which were actually appearing behind these domed buildings. And that caused several years of debate with the World Heritage Committee. At the end, to make it short, in 2005, there was an international conference in Vienna to discuss the introduction of new architecture into historic context, which came out with this Vienna Memorandum of 2005, which gave the definition to historic urban landscape, which has now then been taken over to the UNESCO recommendation of 2011, which is I think important. We discussed it today in the meeting. So it's important that we don't look only at the World Heritage, we also look at what happens around it, because the management especially needs a broader definition. This is a World Heritage Site. It's Baku. This is the World Heritage Site. And this is the surrounding area. Here is a so-called flame tower. Very old flame tower, at least medieval or maybe even older. And here are the new flame towers which are built next door. The problem is that these types of new constructions, when they are undermining actually the significance of historic sites, it becomes a risk, which is more than a challenge. These issues are one of the points that are being discussed by the World Heritage Committee. Of course, one of the issues is the culture versus economy. And I think in principle, if we recognize culture as important, we should understand that culture can be the driver for economy. The problem is that many economists don't see culture that way. They consider that culture does not produce anything, and so the only way that culture can produce something is through tourism or cultural industry. And so very often this is forgotten. This is Kotor in Montenegro, which was damaged by the earthquake in '79 and is now it's a World Heritage Site. The problem here is that the World Heritage Site is actually the whole rather big cultural landscape area. The problem here is that the economy has changed. It was based on water management, water accessibility, and now water is no more interesting. We are now talking about land roads and so on. So the land roads go behind those buildings, those villages which are on the waterfront, and they cut away the settlements from the backyard, which used to be for agricultural activities. And therefore, they are undermining the economic continuity. And so again, here too, they are more aiming for tourism. So if we would take this cultural continuity more seriously, it could be important. I would also like to just mention this concept of machinami in Japan, which I think is an interesting concept, which is a bond between historic settlement, community, and the surroundings. So it somehow like brings them together. That's been adopted by the Japanese ICOMOS. If you don't have a copy, I can send you a copy. And as a result now, for example, in Kyoto, the conservation professionals, they are very actively now trying to promote the idea of understanding the significance of historic buildings. Because until some years ago, it was not considered fashionable to live in an old house. But now, particularly in Kyoto, the people are accepting that old house can be fashionable. They like living in old houses. And the town planners have also started reducing the height of tall buildings in the town planning norms. So in order to make it more livable as an environment. So the social cultural authenticity is somehow already embedded into this machinami idea. And you have, of course, this one of the key issues which is relevant to various historic towns such as Sana'a in Yemen. I think I'm going to Sana'a in a couple of weeks' time. I would like to close with some ideas from living religious heritage, making just a quick reference to Land of Life of John Ruskin, saying that things are noble and ignoble in proportion to the fullness of life which they represent, and so on. So I think that we should not, restoration must not kill the historic fabric, it must keep it alive. I think that is one of the issues. And in some way, this relationship of tangible and intangible is one of the issues we have to remember to keep in life, in view. Interesting enough, we had another conference in Japan where the people who were representing the Intangible Cultural Heritage Convention, who were saying that authenticity is not relevant to intangible cultural heritage. And I completely disagree with this idea, because I think that it is truly relevant to intangible. You have true cultural continuity if you you understand it. But in some cases, like the Ise shrine in Japan, it is expressed in the ritual reconstruction of this thing, which so that it has its authenticity in the continuity, using the same type of material, but not in the archaeological artifact. And I also wanted to close with some comments about Bhutan, because I've just been to Bhutan. We were discussing the question of authenticity in relation to Bhutan, especially some restoration projects, because they are also proposed, they have ratified the UNESCO World Heritage Convention, and they want to propose nominate some sites to the World Heritage List. Now, this is one of this is a monastery that we visited. We were received by these two monks who gave piping for us. And we looked at the works that they were doing in this gemba, which means monastery. What is interesting, if you look at this is this facade today and before the restoration started. It looks similar, but it's different, because they have thrown all this wood here away. It is in the rubbish. It was done 6 years ago by a local craftsman, and they thought that it was not good enough for them. Therefore, they wanted to improve. And so this is the new design. It was done by state carpenters. Bhutan is very proud of their traditional continuity. It is a country which has been isolated from the world until the 1970s, more or less. It's only in the 1970s that they have started opening it for tourism and so on. And now they have a constitutional parliament, they have a king. The monks are still very, very powerful, especially in managing their properties like these issues. What is interesting here, that while in the restoration, the windows were completely renovated, all the wooden parts were renovated, the entrance door to the building was kept original. So that is probably from the 17th century. But when you go in, this is a picture before restoration, and this is the picture after the restoration. So here we have completely new wooden fittings inside, but the wall paintings have been kept. They will not be renovated. The interesting thing is that they refer this sort of renovation to the Buddhist sacred texts. And they say that their interpretation today of these sacred texts is more perfect than it was before. And therefore, this is better than the previous things which are here hidden behind these issues. What is interesting is that we also went to look at the pillars which have been thrown out. Here are the pillars, and they said they were because they were not in good condition. I said, can you show me where the problem is? And actually they were in good condition. So any conservator could have repaired them perfectly all right, and there was no problem. And they promised to keep them in a museum. We discussed that also with the Minister of Cultural Heritage, and he said he had also made same type of proposal. So in a way, what is interesting in a way is that with this sort of gradual development, the Bhutan cultural heritage is coming. I mean, until now it is basically the intangible cultural heritage which is important. Because for them, the building is only a container for their heritage. The building for them has no particular value. So the building is not cultural heritage. What is inside in the building, what is cultural heritage? This is cultural heritage that you have here. But the building itself, this is not cultural heritage. So what they are doing very often is that they maintain the stone walls and they renew the wooden parts. We had a Japanese colleague who was making a little lecture because we had a seminar with the ministers and so on. And my Japanese colleague, Professor Nishimura, was showing Japanese case studies, saying that in Japan we always keep the wooden parts and we change the stone walls. Just to make the difference. Anyway, of course the stone walls are made perhaps of mud brick and so on. Anyway, what is interesting is that we are gradually, they are also expanding this concept of cultural heritage to this type of decoration into their modern architecture. This is Thimphu, which is the capital city. There are some traditional buildings here, in the urban area, and lots of them in the rural areas. So it had actually maintained the cultural character of their architecture. It's very well maintained. But now they are also putting the same type of decoration to the new construction, new buildings. We have here a main street, and even the police boot is made in the Buddhist architecture. And we have, but we already are beginning to see modern intervention, like these sort of glass walls, which have nothing to do with this concept. But in the earth, even the airport, is a typical 18th century traditional airport. Now, so the living religious heritage has been discussed recently. I'm just showing this is a publication. You can actually download it from ICROM's website. And it gives some identification of the challenges that we are facing when dealing with religious cultural heritage, because it's not necessarily always linked with what conservation professionals might want to have. In Kiev in 2010, we had a meeting, a conference, a UNESCO conference, discussing this issue, and there is some sort of Kiev statement of protection of religious properties within the framework of World Heritage Convention. So this is one of the issues which is now coming up, and which I think needs special attention. And I wanted to close with this little image from Japan. It is an island called Taketomi Island, close to the far southern islands. So here we have this utaki. Utaki is sort of natural site, which is associated with some spirits, ancestors, natural spirits. This particular utaki indicates the position where the divinities arrived on this island from the west. And what is interesting here is that this gentleman, he is a modern person. He is the keeper of the museum. He pays his respects to this utaki. So the worship of utaki is a bit like to the Europeans go to church. It's exactly the same. And they have weekly ceremonies. At each home you have their places where you pay the respects, but you also have some ceremonies which are involved in the whole community. What is interesting here is that we see that there are other stones here. These are the previous utaki stones, which when they are the utaki, they have a meaning. The meaning is there. But when it is replaced with a new stone, the old stone loses its meaning. It has no meaning anymore. It's simply a stone. This is the stone with a meaning, and this is a stone with no meaning. I think this is interesting, because you can associate meaning and significance to a place, And you can remove this meaning and significance. That is typically African, but I think we do it the same. We also forget about the meaning and significance. Therefore, if we are talking about authenticity, I think it is important that we maintain this significance alive. And it's only through actually being active and working for it. It is not automatic. It doesn't stay there. And that's the reason why we have all these problems. Thank you.